Three fighter pilots disappeared in 1944. 65 years later, their planes were found almost intact. March 15, 2009, the Swiss Alps. Three mountaineers roped themselves together against the biting wind, their breath forming ice crystals in the thin mountain air. What they're about to discover will shatter the silence that has held three families captive for over 6 decades. Buried beneath tons of pristine snow, three World War II fighter planes sit perfectly preserved, as if waiting to tell their story. Inside the cockpits, personal belongings untouched by time hold secrets that will change everything these families thought they knew about their lost heroes. But before we dive into this mystery that spans generations, please like, subscribe to the channel, and comment on what you think happened to these pilots. Your opinion could be the key to understanding this incredible story. The morning started like any other for the mountaineering expedition. The crunch of snow beneath their boots, the metallic taste of thin air, the familiar burn in their lungs as they climbed higher into the Alps. These weren't amateur climbers. They were seasoned professionals, used to the mountain's tricks and dangers. But nothing could have prepared them for what the melting glacier would reveal. As the lead climber, Marcus, adjusted his position on the rope, something caught his eye, a glint of metal, foreign against the pristine white landscape. At first, he thought it might be climbing gear left behind by previous expeditions. But as he approached, brushing away layers of ancient ice, his heart began to race. The metal wasn't modern equipment. It was painted olive green, with faded military markings barely visible beneath decades of frost. "Hans, come look at this!" Marcus called to his teammate, his voice echoing across the empty peaks. The sound seemed to disturb something sacred in the mountain silence. What they uncovered defied belief. Not one, but 3 aircraft, frozen in time like insects trapped in amber. The cockpit canopies were intact, and through the frosted glass, they could make out shapes inside, helmets, control panels, and scattered papers that should have been destroyed by time, but instead waited patiently for discovery. The smell hit them next. Not decay, but the metallic scent of old machinery mixed with something else. Leather. Oil. The ghost of lives interrupted. Hans, the team's photographer, raised his camera with trembling hands, knowing he was documenting something that would make headlines around the world. But here's what none of them realized in that moment of awe. This discovery would unleash a chain of events that would force 3 families across 2 continents to confront truths they never imagined. In Geneva, 68-year-old Helena was going through her morning routine, organizing her papers with the same meticulous care she'd used as an archivist for 40 years. She had no idea that in a few hours, a phone call would shatter the careful order of her life. In Manchester, Margaret was tending to her garden, the same bitter thoughts about her father's supposed cowardice playing through her mind like a broken record. And in Boston, retired Professor Thomas was lecturing about World War II aviation history, never knowing he was teaching about the very squadron his uncle had died serving. The mountain had kept its secrets for 65 years. Now it was ready to speak. But would the truth these families were about to uncover be a blessing? Or a curse they never saw coming? Helena's phone rang at exactly 2:47 p.m., cutting through the afternoon silence of her Geneva apartment like a blade. She had just finished cataloging her grandmother's old photographs, a ritual that brought her comfort in her retirement. The voice on the other end was formal, Swiss, precise, but the words that followed would shatter the carefully constructed peace she'd built around her grandfather's disappearance. "Ms. Weber, this is Inspector Claude Bernetti with the Swiss Federal Police. We need to discuss a discovery in the Alps that may concern your family." Helena's hand tightened around the receiver. In her 68 years, she had learned to read the weight in people's voices. This wasn't a routine call. The inspector's tone carried something heavier, the gravity of secrets about to surface. "We've found what appears to be your grandfather's aircraft from 1944. The preservation is Remarkable. The photograph of her grandfather, the same one that had watched over her childhood from the mantel, seemed to stare at her with new intensity. Captain Friedrich Weber, missing in action, March 1944. No body, no closure, just questions that had echoed through 3 generations of women who learned to live with ghosts. But Helena wasn't the only one receiving life-changing news that day. In Manchester, Margaret Thompson was kneeling in her garden when her mobile buzzed. The soil under her fingernails, the smell of fresh earth, the routine comfort of tending to her roses, all of it would feel different after this conversation. The British official's voice was measured, careful, as if he understood the weight of what he was about to say. "Mrs. Thompson, we've been contacted by Swiss authorities regarding your father, Squadron Leader James Bennett. There's been a discovery." Margaret's father. The man she'd spent 65 years believing was a coward. The father whose supposed desertion had painted her entire childhood with shame. Her neighbors still whispered about the Bennett family disgrace, how James had abandoned his mission and his men. Margaret had built her identity around that shame, wearing it like armor against a world that judged her for sins she never committed. 3,000 miles away in Boston, Thomas Chen was in his university office when the call came. Books on military aviation surrounded him, his life's work studying the very war that had claimed his uncle. The irony wasn't lost on him, as an American military historian explained that his research had just become deeply personal. "Professor Chen, this concerns your uncle. Lieutenant David Chen, reported missing March 1944. We believe we've located his aircraft." Thomas had spent decades teaching about World War II aviation casualties. He knew the statistics, the survival rates, the tactical failures that led to losses. But he'd never known that his uncle, his father's younger brother who died before Thomas was born, was part of the squadron he'd been researching for 30 years. The Swiss Federal Police had a problem. 3 aircraft meant 3 families across 3 countries. 3 sets of next of kin who would need to be contacted. 3 separate legal jurisdictions that would complicate what should have been a straightforward recovery operation. But Inspector Bernetti had seen enough cold cases to know that nothing involving family secrets ever stayed straightforward. Helena was the first to arrive in Switzerland. Her train pulled into Zurich as dawn broke over Lake Geneva, the mountains standing like silent sentinels in the distance. She'd packed her grandfather's medals, his letters, every piece of documentation she'd preserved with archival precision over the decades. If this was real, if they'd really found him, she wanted to be ready. The morgue smell hit her first, antiseptic and cold, mixed with something else she couldn't identify. Inspector Bernetti led her through sterile corridors that echoed with their footsteps, each sound a countdown to answers she'd waited her entire life to hear. "The preservation is unlike anything we've seen," Bernetti explained, his English precise but colored with French accent. "The altitude, the glacier conditions, it's created a natural freezer. Everything is intact. Everything, including the questions that would soon multiply beyond anything Helena could have imagined." But what Helena didn't know yet was that her grandfather's final mission wasn't what the military records claimed. And the other 2 families flying in to join her weren't just fellow mourners. They were pieces of a puzzle that would reveal something far more dangerous than 3 missing pilots. Something that powerful people had spent 65 years ensuring would stay buried in the ice forever. The conference room in the Swiss Federal Police Building felt like a courtroom waiting for a verdict. Helena arrived first, her leather portfolio containing decades of preserved memories, organized with the precision that had defined her career as an archivist. The morning light streaming through the windows cast long shadows across the polished table, where 3 families would confront a shared tragedy they never knew they had in common. Margaret walked in 10 minutes later, her posture rigid with the defensive stance she'd carried for 65 years. The shame of being James Bennett's daughter had shaped every interaction, every relationship, every moment of her life. She nodded curtly at Helena. Two women bound together by loss, but separated by the different ways they'd processed their grief. When Thomas entered, the dynamic shifted. His academic bearing, his careful notes, his detached scholarly approach to what should have been deeply personal. It created a tension that filled the room like static electricity. Here was a man who had spent decades studying the war that killed his uncle, never knowing he was researching his own family history. Inspector Bernetti placed 3 files on the table. 3 names, 3 lives that ended on the same day in the same place, but whose stories had been scattered across different countries, different narratives, different versions of the truth. Before we proceed, Bernetti began, his voice carrying the weight of experience with family reunifications, you should know that what we've found challenges the official records. Your relatives weren't on the mission they were supposed to be on. The words hung in the air like smoke. Helena's organized world, where everything had a place and every document told a clear story, began to shift. Margaret felt the familiar knot in her stomach tighten. More shame, more complications to the disgrace she'd carried. Thomas, the historian, leaned forward with professional curiosity that barely masked personal fear. The aircraft were found approximately 15 kilometers from their intended flight path, Bernetti continued, opening the first file. This suggests they deliberately deviated from their mission. We've recovered personal effects, radio equipment, and documentation that indicates they were investigating something that wasn't in their orders. The first photograph made Helena gasp. Her grandfather's wristwatch, the same one she remembered from childhood stories, still strapped to skeletal remains that had been preserved in the mountain cold. But it was what surrounded the watch that changed everything. Maps that showed locations nowhere near their supposed target. Coordinates written in her grandfather's careful handwriting that pointed to areas deep in Nazi-controlled territory. Margaret stared at the second photograph. Her father's squadron leader insignia, still pinned to a uniform that looked like it could have been pressed yesterday. But beside it lay documents in her father's handwriting, tactical notes that described reconnaissance of German supply routes. These weren't the writings of a coward. These were the careful observations of a soldier going above and beyond his duty. Thomas studied the third set of photographs with the analytical eye he'd trained on military history for 3 decades. His uncle's navigator equipment was exactly where it should be, but the calculations written on surviving paper showed flight paths into areas that no Allied aircraft should have been investigating in March 1944. These men hadn't gotten lost. They'd been hunting. There's something else, Bernetti said, his tone growing heavier. We've found evidence that they transmitted radio signals during their final days. Someone knew they were out there. Someone received their intelligence. But there's no record of any response or rescue attempt. The implication hit all 3 families simultaneously. Their relatives hadn't just died in a tragic accident or failed mission. They'd been abandoned, left to freeze in the mountains, while whoever received their intelligence did nothing to save them. But Helena, with her archivist's instinct for hidden patterns, noticed something else in the photographs. The documents were too well preserved, too carefully arranged. It was almost as if someone had prepared the cockpits to tell a specific story. "Inspector," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the heavy silence, "how exactly were these documents positioned when you found them?" Bernetti paused, consulting his notes. "That's unusual. They were arranged almost deliberately, as if the pilots knew someone would eventually find them and wanted to leave a clear message." Margaret looked up from her father's photographs, understanding dawning in her eyes. They knew they weren't coming back. Thomas, the historian, felt pieces clicking together in his mind. This wasn't a deviation from their mission. This was their mission. The official records were falsified. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. These 3 men hadn't died in a tragic accident or act of cowardice. They'd been sent on a secret mission that someone had spent 65 years covering up. A mission important enough to justify erasing them from history. But what were they looking for in those mountains? And who had enough power to make 3 Allied heroes disappear from official records? The answers lay buried not just in the ice, but in classified files that someone had hoped would never see daylight. Files that Helena, Margaret, and Thomas were about to discover contained secrets that could rewrite everything they thought they knew about the war, and about the people who were still alive to keep those secrets buried. The Swiss bureaucracy moved like a glacier, slowly, methodically, and with the power to crush anyone who stood in its way. Helena discovered this 2 weeks after that life-changing meeting when she attempted to gain access to her grandfather's recovered personal effects. The form she needed required 3 signatures from different departments. Each signature required a separate appointment. Each appointment was scheduled weeks apart. Environmental Impact Assessment, the clerk explained through the bulletproof glass at the Ministry of Alpine Affairs, his tone suggesting this was perfectly reasonable. The crash site is in a protected glacier zone. Any further excavation requires extensive studies. Helena's perfectionist nature, which had served her well for 40 years as an archivist, now became her greatest enemy. She needed every document, every signature, every approval to be perfect. But perfection moved at a pace that felt designed to discourage the curious and exhaust the determined. Margaret faced different obstacles in Manchester. The British Ministry of Defence had classified her father's service record at a level that required security clearance she didn't possess. The woman behind the desk, with her practiced smile and rehearsed responses, delivered devastating news with administrative politeness. "I'm afraid Squadron Leader Bennett's file contains information that remains sensitive to national security. You'll need to apply for special access, which requires sponsorship from a current military officer of appropriate rank." The irony wasn't lost on Margaret. Her father, whom she'd believed was a coward, apparently had secrets important enough that the government still protected them 65 years later. But getting access to those secrets meant proving she deserved to know the truth about her own father. Thomas encountered the most unexpected resistance. His university, which had celebrated his military history expertise for 3 decades, suddenly questioned his objectivity now that his research had become personal. Department head Dr. Patricia Morrison called him into her office on a gray Boston morning that matched the conversation's tone. "Thomas, we need to discuss your recent development. The board is concerned about your continued involvement in the Alpine Recovery Project. There are questions about academic integrity when a researcher becomes personally invested in his subject matter." The institutional support that had been his professional foundation for decades crumbled in a single meeting. His access to military archives was suspended pending review. His upcoming sabbatical to Switzerland was cancelled. The university that had been his home was now treating him like a liability. But bureaucratic obstacles were only the beginning. Helena's first real victory came when she discovered that Swiss environmental law contained an exception for archaeological discoveries of historical significance. Her grandfather's crash site qualified, but only if she could prove the mission had intelligence value that remained relevant to historical understanding. This requirement led her to the Swiss National Archives, where she spent days in climate-controlled reading rooms that smelled of old paper and preservation chemicals. The familiar environment should have comforted her, but instead it highlighted how alone she was in this fight. Every document she requested came with delays, restrictions, and redactions that turned historical records into puzzles with missing pieces. Margaret's breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Her father's former mechanic, now 94 and living in a Liverpool nursing home, remembered details that weren't in any official record. Harold Penfold's hands shook as he spoke, but his memory was sharp as the tools he'd once used to maintain Squadron Leader Bennett's aircraft. "Your father came to me before that last mission," Harold whispered, his voice barely audible over the nursing home's ambient noise. "Asked me to install extra fuel tanks, unofficial, like said he might need to fly further than the maps showed." Extra fuel tanks meant extended range. Extended range meant a mission longer than officially recorded. Margaret realized her father hadn't just deviated from his flight plan, he'd prepared for a mission that differed from his official orders. Thomas found his path forward through academic contacts outside his university. Retired professors, who remembered when scholarship mattered more than politics, helped him access private military collections and family archives that wouldn't be restricted by institutional policies. But each document he uncovered deepened the mystery rather than solving it. The three families maintained contact through encrypted email, sharing discoveries and coordinating their separate investigations. Helena's methodical documentation skills, Margaret's growing determination to clear her father's name, and Thomas's historical expertise created an unexpected partnership that transcended their initial awkwardness. But their collaboration attracted attention they hadn't anticipated. Helena noticed her apartment building's mailbox had been tampered with. Margaret received calls from people claiming to be journalists, but asking questions that seemed more like interrogations. Thomas discovered that someone had accessed his university computer account using credentials he'd never shared. The message was clear. Someone wanted them to stop digging. The question was why? What had three Allied pilots discovered in 1944 that was still dangerous enough to warrant surveillance and intimidation in 2009? And who had enough influence to coordinate bureaucratic obstacles across three countries? Helena, organizing her research in the methodical way that had defined her career, began to see patterns in the resistance they were facing. The delays weren't random bureaucratic incompetence. They were coordinated, strategic, designed to exhaust their resources and test their commitment. Someone was buying time. Time to decide how to handle three families who were getting too close to secrets that were supposed to stay buried forever. But Helena had spent her career preserving the past. Margaret had spent her life defending her father's memory. And Thomas had dedicated his scholarship to understanding historical truth. They weren't giving up, not when they were this close to answers, not when they could feel how desperately someone wanted them to quit. The helicopter's rotors chopped through the thin alpine air like mechanical heartbeats, each revolution carrying Helena closer to answers she'd waited 65 years to find. Below them, the Swiss Alps spread out like a frozen cemetery, pristine and beautiful and hiding secrets in every crevice. The pilot's voice crackled through her headset. Crash site in 2 minutes. Weather window is narrow. We have maybe an hour before conditions deteriorate. Helena pressed her face to the window, watching the landscape that had claimed her grandfather transform from postcard beauty to harsh reality. The mountains weren't just scenic. They were predators, patient and merciless, capable of preserving the dead while slowly consuming the living who dared to challenge them. Margaret sat across from her, gripping the safety harness with white knuckles. Flying had never been easy for the daughter of a pilot who never came home. But facing her fears felt necessary, now that she understood her father hadn't been running from danger. He'd been flying straight into it. Thomas occupied the remaining seat, his camera ready to document everything with the precision his academic training demanded. But his hands trembled slightly as they approached the coordinates that would transform his uncle from historical statistic to personal reality. The crash site appeared suddenly, a scar in the pristine white that shouldn't have been visible but somehow demanded attention. The helicopter settled onto a flat area of glacier ice, its landing creating a small snowstorm that quickly settled into the profound silence that only exists at high altitude. Helena stepped onto the ice first, her breath forming clouds that dissipated immediately in the dry air. The cold bit through her insulated clothing, sharp and immediate, making her understand viscerally what her grandfather's final days must have felt like. But it was the smell that stopped her. Metallic, ancient, like blood mixed with machine oil, preserved in the eternal refrigerator of the mountains. The three aircraft sat exactly where they'd fallen 65 years ago, partially exposed by recent melting, but still mostly encased in ice that had protected them from decay. Helena approached her grandfather's plane, a British Spitfire that looked like it could fly again if someone just melted the ice from its engines. Through the frosted canopy, she could see the outline of the pilot's seat, still occupied by remains that the mountain had mummified with precise, horrible care. Personal effects scattered around the cockpit told stories of final moments. A photograph tucked into the instrument panel, navigation tools positioned as if still in use, a leather-bound logbook that had survived 7 decades of alpine winters. Margaret stood at her father's aircraft, a hurricane fighter that bore scars from combat that had nothing to do with its final crash. Bullet holes in the fuselage told stories of battles fought and survived before that last mission into the unknown. Her father had been an experienced pilot, a survivor, not the coward she'd believed him to be. Thomas examined his uncle's P-51 Mustang with the detached precision of a scholar. But his professional composure cracked when he saw the personal items scattered in the cockpit. A compass that matched one his father had described in family stories. Flight gloves that looked exactly like ones in old photographs. Evidence that the uncle he'd never known had been real, human, 3-dimensional. But it was what surrounded the aircraft that changed everything they thought they understood about their family member's final mission. The 3 planes formed a rough triangle around a flat area of glacier that had been deliberately cleared. Not cleared by the crash, but cleared by human hands. Tool marks in the ice, now 65 years old but still visible, showed where the pilots had worked together to create a landing zone, a camp, a base of operations. "They didn't crash here," Helena whispered, her archivist's eye recognizing the patterns of deliberate organization. "They landed here." Evidence scattered around the improvised camp supported her observation. Radio equipment that had been carefully positioned for optimal transmission. Supply caches buried under rock cairns that the pilots had built to mark their locations. Most shocking of all, observation posts carved into the ice that provided clear sight lines down the mountain toward valleys that shouldn't have been of military interest. Margaret found her father's final entries in a logbook that had been wrapped in waterproof materials and buried near his aircraft. His careful handwriting, familiar from birthday cards she'd kept since childhood, described not a desperate survival situation, but a methodical intelligence-gathering operation. Day 3 confirmed regular supply convoys using Route 7. Pattern suggests major installation nearby. Radio contact with base intermittent due to atmospheric conditions. Proceeding with reconnaissance as ordered. The word ordered hit her like a physical blow. Her father hadn't gone rogue. He'd been following orders, secret orders that someone had erased from official records. Thomas discovered navigation charts in his uncle's aircraft that showed detailed knowledge of German positions that weren't supposed to exist in Allied intelligence until months later. Routes marked with precision that could only come from direct observation. Coordinates that corresponded to targets that wouldn't be bombed until the summer of 1944. These men hadn't stumbled onto intelligence by accident. They'd been sent specifically to gather information that would save thousands of Allied lives in future operations. Information so valuable that their mission had been classified at levels that survived their deaths. But the most disturbing discovery came when Helena examined the radio equipment more closely. The sets were configured for transmission, not just reception. These pilots had been sending regular reports back to base. Someone knew exactly where they were and what they were doing. Someone had received their intelligence and made the decision not to extract them. The weather began to deteriorate as they explored the site. Wind picking up and snow starting to fall in the way that Alpine guides knew meant serious trouble. But Helena couldn't leave without understanding why 3 aircraft were positioned in a defensive formation around their improvised camp. Thomas found the answer in his uncle's final logbook entry, written in increasingly shaky handwriting as exposure took its toll. German patrol observed 1,400 hours, compromised, destroying sensitive materials. If found, tell families we completed the mission. Intelligence transmitted. Tell them we were heroes, not victims. The pilots hadn't died in a crash. They'd been discovered by enemy forces and made a conscious decision to destroy their evidence rather than let it fall into German hands. Their deaths weren't tragic accidents. They were the final act of a mission that required the ultimate sacrifice. But as the helicopter lifted them away from the crash site, Helena couldn't shake the feeling that they'd missed something important. The camp had been too well organized, too carefully planned for a last-minute reconnaissance mission. These pilots had known they weren't coming back long before they encountered that German patrol. Someone had sent them on a suicide mission disguised as intelligence gathering. The question was, who had that kind of authority? And what intelligence was valuable enough to justify sacrificing 3 experienced pilots? The answers, Helena realized, weren't buried in the ice. They were hidden in classified files that someone had spent 65 years ensuring would never see daylight. The forensic laboratory in Zurich smelled of chemicals and precision, a sterile environment where the past was carefully coaxed back to life through scientific methodology. Helena watched through observation windows as technicians in white coats used specialized equipment to separate the pages of her grandfather's logbook, pages that had been frozen together for 65 years, but preserved with startling clarity. Dr. Sarah Kellner, the lead forensic historian, handled the documents with the reverence of a priest touching sacred relics. Each page was photographed, scanned, and chemically analyzed before being carefully separated from its neighbors. The process was painstakingly slow, but the results were revolutionary. "The preservation is extraordinary," Dr. Kellner explained, her German accent making her English precise and formal. "The altitude, the consistent sub-zero temperatures, the glacier's protection from oxygen. It's created perfect conditions for organic preservation. Even the ink is readable." The first revelation came from entries that predated the pilot's final mission by weeks. Helena's grandfather hadn't been assigned to the Alpine reconnaissance suddenly. He'd been preparing for it since early February, conducting training flights over Swiss airspace that weren't recorded in any official logs. Margaret leaned over Helena's shoulder as Dr. Kellner read aloud from Squadron Leader Bennett's entries. February 15, 1944. Briefed on Operation Glacier by Colonel Morrison. Mission parameters classified beyond normal intelligence protocols. Selected for specialized Alpine survival training. Next of kin notification suspended per operational security requirements. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. Her father had known he was being prepared for a mission that his family wouldn't be told about. The military had deliberately ensured that if something went wrong, there would be no official record of where he'd gone or why. Thomas studied his uncle's logbook with growing unease. Lieutenant Chen's entries revealed mathematical calculations that had nothing to do with standard navigation. Coordinates that corresponded to locations far from any known military targets. Most disturbing of all, references to package delivery that appeared throughout February and March 1944. "This wasn't reconnaissance," Thomas said quietly, his historian's training recognizing patterns that didn't match official narratives. They were delivering something, or someone. Dr. Kellner paused her work, looking up at the 3 family members with the expression of someone who discovered something she wished she hadn't. "There's something else you need to see. The logbooks contain identical entries for specific dates, written in different handwriting but containing the same information. These pilots were copying intelligence from a single source." She placed 3 photocopied pages side by side, one from each pilot's logbook. The entries for March 10, 1944, were nearly word-for-word identical, describing German troop movements and supply routes with precision that suggested direct observation. But the handwriting analysis revealed something impossible. All 3 entries had been written by the same person. Someone was feeding them intelligence and having them copy it into their personal logbooks, Helena realized, her archivist's experience with document authentication making the deception obvious. They were being set up to carry false information. But why would Allied Command want their own pilots to carry false intelligence? The answer came from the logbook's final entries, written in the pilots' actual handwriting as their situation deteriorated on the glacier. Helena's grandfather's final entry, written in increasingly shaky script as hypothermia set in, revealed the truth. March 18, 1944. Radio contact confirms intelligence was disinformation. Our mission was to ensure German intercept of false invasion plans. We were never meant to return. Tell Helena her grandfather died to save D-Day. The laboratory fell silent except for the hum of preservation equipment. 3 families had spent decades believing their relatives died in a reconnaissance mission gone wrong. In reality, they'd been sacrificed as part of an elaborate deception operation designed to mislead German intelligence about Allied invasion plans. Margaret's hand shook as she processed the implications. Her father hadn't been a coward or even a hero in the traditional sense. He'd been a knowing sacrifice, a pawn in a game so complex that his own command had erased him from history to protect the deception. Thomas, the military historian, understood the strategic brilliance and moral horror of what they'd discovered. Operation Fortitude, the Allied deception campaign surrounding D-Day, had required elaborate false intelligence to convince German command that the invasion would come at Calais rather than Normandy. But he'd never imagined it involved sacrificing experienced pilots as unwitting messengers. The German patrol that discovered them, Helena said slowly, pieces clicking together in her methodical mind. It wasn't a chance encounter. Someone told the Germans where to find them. Dr. Kellner nodded grimly. The evidence supports that conclusion. The timing was too precise, the location too specific. Someone in Allied command ensured that the pilots and their false intelligence would be captured by German forces. But the most chilling discovery came from a coded message hidden in the margin of Thomas's uncle's logbook. Using a simple substitution cipher that military intelligence had taught him, Lieutenant Chen had left a final message that revealed the operation's true scope. Operation Glacier involves multiple teams. We are Team 3. Others already sacrificed. Handler identified as Colonel Morrison. Real mission: ensure German intercept of false D-Day plans. Success requires our capture and death. God forgive what we've done. The implications were staggering. 3 teams of Allied pilots had been sacrificed to sell the deception. Helena, Margaret, and Thomas weren't just dealing with their own family tragedies. They'd uncovered evidence of a war crime committed by their own side. Colonel Morrison. The name appeared in all 3 logbooks, always in connection with classified briefings and mission parameters that exceeded normal operational security. A man who had sent dozens of pilots to their deaths while their families believed they were heroes. But here's what terrified Helena as she organized the evidence with her characteristic precision. If Colonel Morrison had been willing to sacrifice Allied pilots to protect D-Day, what would he do to protect himself from exposure 65 years later? And if he was still alive, how far would he go to ensure that 3 families stopped asking questions about Operation Glacier? The answers to those questions were about to become more personal than any of them could have imagined. Because Colonel Morrison hadn't just covered up their relatives' deaths, he'd built an entire post-war life on the secret of what he'd done in those alpine mountains, a life that 3 persistent family members were now threatening to destroy. Helena's phone buzzed at 6:47 a.m. with news that turned her blood cold. The text message was from Inspector Bernetti, but the words read like a death sentence for their investigation. Emergency meeting required. Development company claims legal ownership of crash site. Excavation halted pending litigation. Alpine Resort International had materialized overnight like a corporate ghost, complete with paperwork dating back months that somehow nobody had noticed before. Their legal team arrived at the crash site with heavy machinery, surveying equipment, and court orders that superseded the archaeological protection Helena had fought so hard to secure. The company's representative, a sharp-suited man named Klaus Weber, bore an unsettling resemblance to Helena. Same bone structure, same gray eyes, same methodical way of organizing documents. But where Helena used her precision to preserve the past, Klaus seemed determined to bury it under tons of concrete and steel. "This is prime real estate," Klaus explained to the assembled group at the emergency meeting, his English perfect but emotionally cold. "The glacier recession has exposed terrain ideal for luxury development. Our environmental impact studies show that excavation actually benefits the ecosystem by removing foreign objects. Foreign objects. That's how he described 3 Allied heroes and the evidence of their sacrifice. Margaret felt her familiar anger rising, but this time it was directed at the living rather than the dead. 65 years of believing her father was a coward, followed by weeks of discovering his heroism, only to have corporate lawyers dismiss his remains as obstacles to profit. The injustice was suffocating. Thomas, accustomed to academic battles over research funding and publication rights, recognized the signs of a coordinated assault. Alpine Resort International wasn't just any development company. Their legal strategy was too sophisticated, their timing too perfect, their resources too extensive for a routine business venture. "Who owns Alpine Resort International?" Thomas asked, his historian's instincts sensing patterns behind the corporate facade. Klaus Weber's smile never wavered, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or calculation. "Our ownership structure is complex, involving multiple international partnerships. I'm sure your lawyers can access the relevant filings through appropriate channels." The appropriate channels, as Helena discovered that afternoon, led through a maze of shell companies, offshore holdings, and legal structures designed to obscure rather than illuminate. But her archival training had taught her to trace connections through seemingly unrelated documents, and what she found made her hands shake. Alpine Resort International was ultimately owned by Morrison Holdings, a private investment firm that had been quietly acquiring Alpine properties for decades. The Morrison name couldn't be coincidental. Not when Colonel Morrison appeared in all 3 pilots' logbooks as the handler who'd sent them to their deaths. But James Morrison, according to public records, had died in 1987. His estate had been managed by a trust that provided comfortable anonymity for its beneficiaries, a trust that had been remarkably active in purchasing properties throughout the Alps, always in areas where wartime activities might have left inconvenient evidence. Margaret's research into her father's military records revealed another disturbing pattern. Other pilots from Squadron Leader, Bennett's unit, had died in training accidents and mechanical failures throughout 1944 and 1945. Men who might have known about Operation Glacier had been systematically eliminated, their deaths spread across enough time and locations to avoid suspicion. The families faced a legal battle they couldn't afford against opponents with unlimited resources and decades of preparation. Alpine Resort International had permits, environmental clearances, and political support from officials who spoke eloquently about economic development and job creation. 3 elderly family members with questions about 65-year-old war crimes seemed quaint by comparison. But Helena had spent her career understanding how institutions preserve and destroy information. She knew that corporate records, like government files, left traces that careful researchers could follow. The key was finding someone inside the system who understood what they were really fighting. Her breakthrough came from an unexpected source: the original mountaineers who'd discovered the crash site. Marcus, the lead climber, had been bothered by something since that first day on the glacier. The way Alpine Resort International had appeared so quickly, the precision of their legal documentation, the suspicious timing of their development plans. "They were already surveying the area before we found the planes," Marcus told Helena during a clandestine meeting in a Zurich cafe. "I saw their equipment markers weeks earlier, but didn't think much of it. Now I'm wondering if they were looking for something specific." Marcus had photographs from his pre-discovery climbs that showed surveying stakes and measurement equipment positioned around the crash site. Alpine Resort International hadn't responded to the discovery of the planes. They'd been waiting for it. Someone had known exactly where the aircraft were buried and had been preparing to destroy the evidence long before the families learned the truth. Thomas's academic contacts provided another piece of the puzzle. Military historians across Europe had been receiving inquiries about Operation Glacier for months before the Alpine discovery. Someone had been systematically researching the operation, identifying potential witnesses, and ensuring that anyone with knowledge of the truth had been located and, in several cases, silenced. Professor Wilhelm Schneider at the University of Vienna had been one of those contacts. He died in a car accident just 3 weeks after being approached by researchers asking about wartime operations in the Alps. The accident report was clean, professional, unremarkable, except that Professor Schneider had been one of the world's leading experts on Operation Fortitude and its deception components. The pattern was becoming clear. Someone with significant resources and long-term planning capability had been eliminating evidence and witnesses related to Operation Glacier for decades. The development threat wasn't just about hiding the crash site. It was the final move in a cleanup operation that had been running since 1944. Helena realized they were fighting more than corporate lawyers and bureaucratic delays. They were up against an organization that had spent 65 years perfecting the art of making inconvenient truths disappear. An organization that viewed 3 elderly family members not as grieving relatives, but as threats to be neutralized. But what these corporate predators didn't understand was that Helena had spent her entire career preserving information that powerful people wanted destroyed. Margaret had spent 65 years defending her father's memory against a world that called him a coward. And Thomas had dedicated his life to uncovering historical truths that others preferred to keep buried. They weren't giving up, not when they were this close to exposing the truth, even if that truth was more dangerous than any of them had imagined. The ground-penetrating radar equipment hummed with electronic precision as it swept across the glacier, revealing secrets that lay deeper than anyone had imagined. Helena had convinced Inspector Bernetti to authorize one final archaeological survey before Alpine Resort International's legal machine could shut down the site permanently. What the radar revealed made everyone forget about corporate lawyers and development permits. 20 meters beneath the 3 known aircraft, the scanning equipment detected a 4th aircraft, larger than the others, positioned deliberately below the crash site like a metallic foundation supporting the entire operation. The radar signature suggested a transport plane, something capable of carrying cargo or passengers far from any battlefield. Dr. Sarah Kellner coordinated the excavation with the urgency of someone who understood they were racing against time and corporate interference. The drilling equipment carved through 65 years of accumulated ice with mechanical persistence, each meter revealing more evidence that Operation Glacier had been far more complex than 3 pilots carrying false intelligence. Margaret watched the excavation with growing unease. Her father's heroic sacrifice had been devastating enough to process, but the possibility that he'd been part of something even larger, something that required a transport aircraft and underground positioning, suggested layers of deception that made her question everything she'd learned about the war. Thomas documented each stage of the excavation with academic precision, but his historian's instincts were screaming warnings. Transport aircraft in this location made no strategic sense unless they were part of an operation that went far beyond military deception. This was starting to look like smuggling, extraction, or worse. The first breakthrough came when the drilling reached the transport plane's cargo compartment. The ice that had preserved everything else for 65 years had also preserved the wooden crates that filled the aircraft's interior. Crates marked with symbols that none of them recognized, but that seemed to carry weight beyond mere cargo identification. Helena's organizational mind immediately categorized what they were seeing: military transport, specialized cargo, hidden location, deliberate concealment. This wasn't evidence of a heroic mission gone wrong. This was evidence of something that powerful people had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide. The symbols on the crates meant nothing to the archaeological team, but they triggered immediate recognition in Thomas when he photographed them. As a military historian specializing in World War II operations, he'd seen similar markings in classified documents that had been declassified decades after the war. These weren't standard military cargo symbols. They were SS identification marks. "We need to stop the excavation," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood they'd crossed a line into dangerous territory. These aren't Allied cargo containers. But Helena's determination to understand her grandfather's fate overrode academic caution. She'd spent 65 years wondering what had happened to the man whose photograph watched over her childhood. She wasn't stopping now, regardless of what political complications they might uncover. The first crate they opened contained documents that had been preserved in waterproof containers with the same meticulous care that had protected the pilot's logbooks. But these weren't military reports or false intelligence. They were transfer papers, identification documents, and financial records that told a story none of them had been prepared to discover. Operation Glacier hadn't been a military deception operation. It had been an extraction mission. The documents revealed a network of high-ranking Nazi officials who had been secretly negotiating surrender terms with Allied intelligence throughout 1943 and 1944. Not the public surrender that ended the war, but private arrangements that guaranteed safe passage, new identities, and comfortable exile in exchange for intelligence about German military capabilities and war crimes evidence. Margaret's father hadn't died carrying false D-Day intelligence. He'd died protecting the extraction of Nazi war criminals who were being smuggled to safety by the same Allied command that would later prosecute their subordinates at Nuremberg. The second crate contained passenger manifests that made Helena's blood run cold. Names, photographs, and detailed biographies of German officers, SS officials, and concentration camp administrators who had been designated for special handling by Allied intelligence. Men responsible for atrocities that were being documented even as they were being secretly evacuated to safety. But the most disturbing discovery was the signature that appeared on every document. Colonel James Morrison, authorizing the transfer of war criminals to secure locations where they could be debriefed without interference from standard military justice procedures. Thomas realized they'd uncovered evidence of a war crime that dwarfed the sacrifice of 3 pilots. Allied command hadn't just known about the Holocaust, they'd actively protected its perpetrators in exchange for intelligence that supposedly shortened the war. The heroes of D-Day had been built on a foundation of moral compromise that none of the history books mentioned. The third crate contained the personal effects of the extracted war criminals, Nazi uniforms, SS insignia, and, most horrifically, documentation from concentration camps that these men had taken as souvenirs of their service, photographs, personal letters, and administrative records that provided evidence of systematic genocide. Helena's methodical mind catalogued each item with professional precision, but her emotional response was growing beyond what she could contain. Her grandfather hadn't just died in a military operation. He'd died protecting evidence of humanity's worst crimes, evidence that someone had considered more valuable than justice. But the fourth crate contained something that changed everything they thought they understood about their relatives' final mission. Personal letters written by the 3 pilots, addressed to their families, explaining what they'd discovered and why they'd made the decision that cost them their lives. Helena's grandfather's letter, written in his familiar handwriting but bearing the weight of moral crisis, revealed the truth that had been hidden for 65 years. My dearest Helena, if you are reading this, it means we have succeeded in stopping something terrible. The men we were ordered to extract are not reformed enemies seeking redemption. They are monsters fleeing justice, carrying evidence of crimes that must not be hidden. We have chosen to ensure that this plane never reaches its destination. We have chosen to die rather than be complicit in evil. Tell my granddaughter that her grandfather chose justice over orders. Tell her that some truths are worth dying for. The three pilots hadn't been sacrificed by their command. They had sacrificed themselves, deliberately sabotaging their mission rather than participate in what they recognized as a betrayal of everything they'd fought to defend. They'd crashed the transport plane and positioned their fighters as guardians, ensuring that the evidence of Allied complicity in protecting war criminals would remain frozen in the alpine ice. But as Helena read her grandfather's final words, she realized that uncovering this truth had put them in the same position that had cost three pilots their lives 65 years ago. They now possessed evidence that could destroy reputations, end careers, and reveal moral compromises that powerful people had spent decades covering up. The question was, what were they willing to sacrifice to ensure this truth reached the world? And more immediately, what would the descendants of Colonel Morrison's organization do to stop them? The letter that changed everything arrived on a Tuesday morning that felt like any other until Helena opened her mailbox. The envelope bore French postmarks and handwriting that belonged to someone whose hands had known decades of careful work. Inside, written in English that carried the slight stiffness of careful translation, were words that made Helena sit down heavily on her apartment steps. Mademoiselle Weber, I have read about your grandfather in the newspapers. I believe I knew him. I believe I was married to him. My name is Marie-Claire Dubois, and I have been waiting 65 years to tell someone the truth about what happened in March 1944. Helena's organized world, where every document had a place and every family connection was carefully catalogued, shattered with the simple revelation that her grandfather had been married to someone she'd never known existed. A marriage that had been hidden not just from Helena's family, but from official records that she'd spent months researching with archival precision. Margaret and Thomas received similar letters the same day, not from unknown wives, but from Marie-Claire describing relationships and connections that had been erased from history along with everything else about Operation Glacier. Her father had carried letters for Marie-Claire. Thomas's uncle had helped establish the safe houses where resistance fighters like Marie-Claire had hidden Allied airmen who'd been shot down behind enemy lines. The address in the letter led to a small village in Provence, where Marie-Claire Dubois lived in a stone house that looked unchanged since 1944. At 89, she moved with the careful deliberation of someone who'd learned to conserve energy for the moments that mattered. But her eyes were sharp with intelligence and memory that had spent decades waiting for the right time to speak. Your grandfather came to my village in February 1944, Marie-Claire explained as she served tea with the formal courtesy that belonged to a different era. He was not on a military mission then. He was preparing for something that he could not explain, but that frightened him more than combat. She led them to a bedroom where a wooden chest contained the carefully preserved evidence of a relationship that had existed in the shadows of war. Love letters written in English and French, describing covert meetings and shared dangers that painted a picture of wartime romance far more complex than anything Helena had imagined about her methodical grandfather. The letters revealed that Captain Friedrich Weber had been part of a resistance network that helped Allied intelligence gather information about German operations in occupied France. But more than that, he'd been investigating rumors about high-ranking German officers who were secretly negotiating with Allied command about post-war arrangements. He told me that some of his superiors were making agreements that betrayed everything they claimed to be fighting for, Marie-Claire said, her voice carrying the weight of secrets that had been too dangerous to share for 65 years. He was ordered to participate in operations that he believed were morally wrong. Margaret listened with growing understanding as Marie-Claire described her father's visits to the village throughout early 1944. Squadron leader Bennett hadn't been on routine reconnaissance missions. He'd been part of a network of pilots who were investigating their own command structure, documenting evidence of corruption and collaboration that reached the highest levels of Allied intelligence. Thomas realized that his uncle's mathematical calculations, which he'd found in the recovered logbooks, weren't navigation computations, but coded coordinates for resistance safe houses and document drops. Lieutenant Chen had been part of an underground network within Allied Command that was trying to expose the Nazi extraction operation from the inside. But Marie Claire's most devastating revelation came when she led them to a hidden compartment in her basement that contained documents the three pilots had entrusted to her before their final mission. Original orders, signed by Colonel Morrison, that proved Operation Glacier was designed to extract not just intelligence, but specific Nazi war criminals who had been guaranteed immunity in exchange for cooperation. "Your relatives knew they were being sent to die," Marie Claire explained, her elderly hands steady as she handled documents that could have gotten her killed if discovered during the war. They had evidence that their mission was designed to fail, that they were meant to be caught by German forces so that their knowledge would die with them. But the pilots had created their own plan. Instead of following Morrison's orders to deliver the war criminals to safe extraction points, they'd decided to ensure that the transport plane carrying the evidence would never reach its destination. They'd chosen to crash the plane and die with it, rather than be complicit in protecting mass murderers. Helena's grandfather's final letter to Marie Claire, written the night before his last mission, revealed the personal cost of his decision. "My dearest wife, I go tomorrow knowing I will not return. But I go knowing that our love was honest in a world full of lies. The evidence of what we have discovered will remain buried until someone with courage finds it. I pray that person will be strong enough to ensure justice, even if it comes too late for the dead." Marie Claire had kept that letter, along with copies of all the evidence the pilots had gathered, hidden in her village for 65 years. She'd never remarried, never had children, never moved away from the place where she'd promised to wait for news of the man who'd chosen death over dishonor. But her preservation of the evidence came with a price that made Helena understand why the old woman had waited so long to speak. Marie Claire revealed that she'd been pregnant when Captain Weber disappeared. She'd given birth to Helena's uncle, a son who'd grown up believing his father was a local resistance fighter who'd died fighting Germans. Helena had family she'd never known existed. French relatives who'd lived their entire lives unaware of their connection to the Alpine tragedy and the moral crisis that had shaped their father's final days. Relatives who were about to learn that their quiet village had been the center of a conspiracy that reached from the mountains of Switzerland to the highest levels of Allied command. But Marie Claire's revelations came with a warning that made all three families understand they were running out of time. She'd been contacted recently by people claiming to be journalists, asking questions about wartime activities in her village. The same pattern of research and elimination that had been following Operation Glacier witnesses for decades had finally reached the one person who possessed evidence that could expose the entire conspiracy. "They offered to buy my house," Marie Claire said quietly, her voice carrying the fear of someone who understood the implications. "They offered far more money than an old woman's cottage should be worth. They were very polite, very professional. They reminded me of the German officers who used to come through the village during the war." Helena realized that uncovering the truth about her grandfather had put them all in danger that went far beyond corporate lawsuits and bureaucratic obstacles. Marie Claire's evidence could prove that Allied command had been complicit in protecting war criminals, that heroes like the three pilots had been murdered to hide corruption that reached the highest levels of military and political leadership. Evidence that powerful people would still kill to protect. But as Helena looked at this elderly French woman who'd spent 65 years keeping faith with a promise made to a dead husband, she understood that some truths were worth any risk. The question was whether they could expose those truths before the people who'd been covering them up for decades decided that 3 more families needed to disappear. The DNA results arrived on a Thursday that started with autumn rain against Helena's Geneva, apartment windows, and ended with revelations. that shattered everything three families thought they knew about themselves. The laboratory report, printed on official letterhead that carried the weight of scientific certainty, contained genetic connections that transformed their investigation from historical research into personal crisis. Helena stared at the results that confirmed Marie Claire's story with molecular precision. Not only did she have a French uncle she'd never known existed, but the DNA analysis revealed connections that spread across three countries and involved people who were very much alive, very much unaware of their true parentage, and very much unprepared for what they were about to learn. Margaret's results contained an even more shocking revelation. Her father had indeed corresponded with Helena's grandfather throughout the war, but their connection went deeper than military friendship. DNA evidence suggested that Squadron Leader Bennett was the biological father of a child born in Switzerland during a previous mission, a child whose descendants had been searching for their family origins for decades. Thomas discovered that his uncle's mathematical precision had extended to careful documentation of personal relationships that created a genetic web across Allied operations. Lieutenant Chen had fathered children with local women in multiple countries, creating family connections that had been hidden not just by wartime secrecy, but by cultural barriers that made such relationships impossible to acknowledge publicly. But the most devastating discovery came when cross-referencing the DNA results with genealogical databases that contained samples from across Europe. The three families weren't just connected to each other, they were connected to living descendants of the Nazi war criminals their relatives had died trying to stop. Marie Claire's son, Jean-Luc, arrived in Geneva with the bewildered expression of someone whose entire identity had been upended by a phone call. At 64, he'd lived his entire life believing he was the son of a French resistance fighter named Pierre Dubois, who died fighting Germans in 1944, learning that his biological father was a British pilot who died protecting evidence of war crimes was devastating enough. Learning that he had family connections across three countries was overwhelming. But Jean-Luc brought with him documents that his mother had never shown to anyone. Birth certificates, medical records, and school documents that revealed how thoroughly the French authorities had cooperated in hiding his true parentage. Someone with significant influence had ensured that Marie Claire's pregnancy and Jean-Luc's birth were officially attributed to a dead resistance fighter rather than a missing Allied pilot. The Swiss family members arrived next. Hans and Greta Müller, siblings in their 70s who'd spent decades researching their grandfather's mysterious disappearance from official records in 1944. They'd believed he was a local mountain guide who'd died, helping Jewish refugees escape across the Alpine passes. Learning that he was actually Squadron Leader Bennett and that Margaret was their half-sister required emotional adjustments that went far beyond family reunification. Hans brought with him boxes of photographs and documents that revealed how their grandfather had used his cover as a mountain guide to gather intelligence about German positions in the Alps. But more importantly, he brought evidence that someone had been systematically researching their family for months, asking questions about wartime activities and offering to purchase family heirlooms at prices that suggested more than casual interest. The American connections proved even more complex. Thomas's uncle had apparently maintained relationships with multiple women across the territories where he'd served, creating a network of children and grandchildren who'd grown up with different names, different nationalities, and different understanding of their heritage. But DNA databases had connected them all, creating a family tree that looked more like a military operation than a genealogical chart. When all the newly discovered family members gathered in Helena's apartment, the room felt charged with the tension of secrets that had spent decades accumulating explosive potential. Conversations happened in 3 languages, with translations that couldn't capture the emotional weight of revelations that challenged everything each person had believed about their identity. But the family reunion was interrupted by a discovery that transformed personal crisis into immediate danger. Jean-Luc had brought with him a letter that Marie Claire had saved but never translated. A German document that had been hidden with her other wartime secrets. When Thomas applied his historical linguistics training to the Gothic script, what he translated made everyone understand why they were being watched. The document was a transfer order, signed by SS Oberfuhrer Klaus Richter, authorizing the evacuation of high-value personnel through Alpine routes secured by Allied intelligence cooperation. But it wasn't just a military document. It was a personal letter that revealed Richter's gratitude to Colonel Morrison for arranging safe passage to Argentina, along with a promise that Morrison's cooperation would be appropriately rewarded after the war. Klaus Richter, the name that appeared on multiple concentration camp administrative documents found in the transport plane. A war criminal who'd been evacuated to safety through Operation Glacier and who'd apparently maintained contact with Colonel Morrison for years after the war ended. Helena's methodical mind immediately connected the patterns. Klaus Weber, the Alpine Resort International representative who looked disturbingly similar to her, wasn't just a coincidental name similarity. The company's aggressive attempts to control the crash site, the sophisticated legal strategy, the international resources, it all pointed to an organization that had been built on Nazi gold and maintained through Allied complicity. Margaret realized that her father's supposed cowardice had been a carefully constructed cover story that protected not just military secrets but personal connections that reached from wartime collaboration to modern corporate power. Squadron leader Bennett hadn't deserted. He'd been murdered to hide evidence that could have exposed war criminals who'd used their Allied protection to build post-war empires. The family connections they'd discovered weren't just emotional revelations. They were evidence of a systematic cover-up that had been maintained for 65 years through a combination of official secrecy, corporate influence, and the elimination of anyone who got too close to the truth. But as Helena looked around her apartment at relatives she'd never known existed, people whose lives had been shaped by secrets they'd never understood, she realized they'd become something more dangerous than curious family members seeking closure. They'd become witnesses to evidence that could expose living war criminals and their corporate descendants who'd built fortunes on stolen wealth and protected positions. Evidence that people had killed to protect in 1944 and would kill to protect again in 2009. But now they weren't just three elderly family members asking questions about their dead relatives. They were an international network of people whose very existence proved that Operation Glacier had been designed to fail, that Allied heroes had been murdered to protect Nazi war criminals, and that the cover-up continued into the present day. The question was, what were they going to do with that knowledge before it got them all killed? The forensic anthropologist's report arrived with conclusions that changed everything they thought they understood about how their relatives had died. Dr. Elena Vasquez had spent weeks analyzing the remains recovered from the crash site, and her findings painted a picture of survival, struggle, and ultimate sacrifice that was far more complex than the clean narrative of heroes dying in a plane crash. The physical evidence indicates that all three pilots survived the initial impact, Dr. Vasquez explained during the video conference that connected the extended family across 3 countries. Bone analysis shows healing from injuries that occurred days or possibly weeks before death. These men didn't die in a crash. They lived for an extended period in extreme conditions before succumbing to exposure and starvation. Helena absorbed this information with the methodical precision that had defined her career. But the emotional impact was devastating. Her grandfather hadn't died quickly in a moment of heroic sacrifice. He'd suffered for weeks in the Alpine cold, knowing he was going to die, choosing every day to continue protecting evidence rather than attempt escape or surrender. Margaret felt the familiar anger rising, but now it was directed at Allied command rather than her father's supposed cowardice. Squadron leader Bennett had been abandoned to die slowly while his superiors, men who'd sent him on a mission designed to fail, continued their comfortable lives. The military heroes she'd been taught to respect had left her father to freeze to death in the mountains. Thomas, analyzing the evidence with his historian's training, recognized patterns that suggested the pilot's final weeks had been far more active than simple survival. Tool marks on the aircraft indicated they'd been systematically dismantling equipment and hiding components. They hadn't just been waiting to die, they'd been working to ensure that certain elements of their mission could never be reconstructed. Dr. Vasquez's most shocking discovery came from analysis of the preserved clothing and personal effects. Hidden in the lining of Captain Weber's flight jacket, sewn with precision that suggested long hours of careful work, was a complete microfilm record of Operation Glacier. Documents, photographs, and correspondence that proved Allied complicity in evacuating Nazi war criminals. The microfilm was sealed in waterproof containers and positioned to ensure discovery, Dr. Vasquez explained. This wasn't hidden accidentally, it was deliberately placed where archaeologists would find it. Your grandfather wanted this evidence to survive even if he couldn't. But the microfilm revealed more than just documentation of war crimes. It contained a complete record of the post-war network that had grown from Morrison's wartime collaboration. Names, dates, financial transfers, and corporate structures that connected 1944's Operation Glacier to 2009's Alpine Resort International, a 65-year conspiracy that had evolved from military cover-up to corporate empire. Helena's expertise in document preservation allowed her to understand the sophisticated planning that had gone into creating this evidence cache. Her grandfather hadn't just documented the immediate operation. He'd anticipated that exposure would require proof of ongoing conspiracy. The microfilm contained bank records, property transfers, and communication logs that traced Morrison's organization through decades of growth and expansion. Margaret discovered that her father's portion of the evidence focused on the personal cost of the operation. Photographs of the concentration camp administrators who were being evacuated, copies of their service records, and documentation of the atrocities they'd committed. Squadron leader Bennett had wanted the world to know exactly who was being protected and what crimes were being covered up. Thomas found that his uncle's contribution was the most strategically valuable. Lieutenant Chen had documented the intelligence value that the war criminals had provided in exchange for their protection. Technical specifications, strategic assessments, and post-war debriefings that proved the Nazi evacuation had continued long after Germany's surrender. Intelligence that had been used to build American advantages in the Cold War that was already beginning in 1944. But the microfilm contained one more element that transformed their understanding of what they were fighting. The pilots had documented not just the immediate conspiracy, but their own investigation into its scope. They'd identified other Allied units that had been compromised, other operations that had been designed to fail, and other heroes who'd been sacrificed to protect collaboration that reached the highest levels of military and political leadership. The evidence suggested that Operation Glacier wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a systematic pattern of Allied collaboration with Nazi war criminals. A pattern that had been covered up through the elimination of witnesses, the destruction of evidence, and the creation of alternative narratives that painted collaboration as heroism and murder as military necessity. Helena realized that her grandfather's final weeks hadn't been spent in passive waiting for death, but in active documentation of a conspiracy that he'd recognized would outlive the war. Every day of suffering in the Alpine cold had been justified by the hope that someday someone would find the evidence and expose the truth. The personal effects revealed the human cost of that decision. Letters written to family members they'd never see again. Photographs kept close even as they froze. Personal items that provided comfort during their final days. But also evidence of growing weakness, diminishing resources, and the gradual acceptance that their sacrifice was the only way to ensure the evidence would survive. Margaret found her father's final diary entry, written in handwriting that showed the effects of extreme cold and malnutrition. Day 23. Radio batteries dead. Food exhausted. But the evidence is secure. They cannot hide what we have documented. Tell Margaret her father died fighting evil, not serving it. Tell her that some truths are worth more than life. Thomas discovered that his uncle had used his mathematical skills to create coded messages that would only make sense to someone with historical training. Coordinates that pointed not to geographical locations but to archived documents in multiple countries. A treasure map that would lead researchers to evidence that the three pilots hadn't been able to carry with them but had identified for future investigation. Dr. Vasquez's final revelation completed the picture of their relatives' final sacrifice. Evidence showed that the pilots had been offered multiple opportunities to surrender to German forces and had refused each time. They'd chosen to die rather than risk exposure under interrogation that might have revealed the location of their evidence cache or compromised the resistance networks that had helped them gather intelligence. But the survival evidence also revealed that their deaths hadn't been inevitable. Radio transmissions indicated that rescue was possible, that Allied command knew where they were and had the resources to extract them. The decision to let them die had been deliberate, calculated, and motivated by the need to eliminate witnesses who possessed evidence that could have destroyed careers and exposed collaboration that reached the highest levels of power. Helena understood that they were now in the same position their relatives had faced 65 years ago. They possessed evidence that could expose living war criminals and their corporate successors, evidence that people had killed to protect and would kill to protect again. But unlike their relatives, they weren't isolated in the mountains with limited resources and no way to communicate with the outside world. They had technology, international connections, and most importantly, each other. The question was whether that would be enough to survive what was coming. Because the people who'd been protecting Operation Glacier's secrets for 65 years were about to discover that their carefully constructed cover-up was unraveling, and that three families had become far more dangerous than three isolated pilots had ever been. The war room that Helena had created in her Geneva apartment looked like something from a thriller film. Walls covered with photographs, documents, and connecting lines that traced relationships between 1944's Operation Glacier and 2009's corporate empire. But this wasn't fiction. Every piece of evidence had been verified, cross-referenced, and documented with the archival precision that had defined Helena's career. The breakthrough came when Thomas connected the microfilm evidence to declassified Cold War documents that had been released by various governments over the previous decade. What emerged was a picture of collaboration that went far beyond wartime expediency and had evolved into a permanent network of influence that shaped international politics for 65 years. Colonel Morrison hadn't just extracted Nazi war criminals. He'd built an organization that used their intelligence, their stolen wealth, and their international connections to create a shadow network that influenced everything from post-war reconstruction to Cold War strategy. The three pilots hadn't died to protect false D-Day intelligence. They died trying to stop the birth of a criminal empire. Margaret's research into corporate structures revealed that Alpine Resort International was just the latest incarnation of companies that had been established with Nazi gold and maintained through a combination of legitimate business and criminal activity. The development threat to the crash site wasn't about hiding evidence. It was about protecting assets that were still generating revenue for the descendants of war criminals. But the scope of the conspiracy became clear only when they traced the financial connections that linked Morrison Holdings to modern political and corporate leadership. The network that had begun with evacuating Nazi war criminals had evolved into an international organization that owned banks, influenced elections, and controlled media companies across multiple countries. Helena's methodical investigation revealed that the mysterious deaths of historians and researchers over the previous decades hadn't been coincidental. Anyone who'd gotten close to exposing Operation Glacier had been systematically eliminated through accidents, suicides, and medical emergencies that left no trace of foul play. The three families weren't just fighting corporate lawyers. They were challenging an organization that had perfected the art of making problems disappear. The personal stakes became clear when Jean-Luc discovered that his mother's village in Provence had been purchased by a company linked to Morrison Holdings just weeks after the Alpine discovery. Marie Claire's house, her neighbor's properties, and the entire area where she'd hidden evidence for 65 years were being acquired through forced sales that used legal pressure and financial incentives that elderly residents couldn't resist. But Marie Claire's evidence wasn't the only thing being systematically acquired. Hans and Greta Müller reported that someone had been purchasing family heirlooms and documents from relatives across Switzerland, always offering prices that seemed too generous, but came with contracts that included permanent confidentiality agreements. Someone was literally buying silence from anyone who might possess evidence about wartime activities. Thomas's academic contacts provided the most disturbing revelation. Universities across Europe and America had been receiving donations from Morrison Holdings subsidiaries, always tied to research programs that focused on World War II history. But these donations came with conditions that gave donors influence over research directions, publication decisions, and faculty hiring. The organization wasn't just hiding evidence, it was controlling the institutions that might expose it. The modern scope of the conspiracy became apparent when Helena traced the corporate structures that controlled Alpine Resort International. The development company was owned by holding companies that were owned by investment firms that were owned by trusts that ultimately traced back to accounts established with Nazi gold in 1944. 65 years of legitimate business had laundered wealth that was originally stolen from Holocaust victims. But the conspiracy's current activities revealed something even more sinister than historical cover-up. The microfilm evidence included bank routing numbers and account information that were still active in 2009. The network wasn't just hiding past crimes, it was continuing to generate revenue from investments that had been made with stolen wealth. Margaret's investigation into her father's military records revealed that Operation Glacier had been part of a larger program that evacuated hundreds of Nazi officials, not just the handful documented in the Alpine evidence. Each evacuation had generated intelligence, stolen wealth, and ongoing obligations that created a network of mutual protection between former Nazis and Allied officials who'd facilitated their escape. The three families realized they weren't just fighting to clear their relatives' names or expose historical truth. They were challenging a criminal organization that had grown from wartime collaboration into a multinational network with assets worth billions of dollars and influence that reached the highest levels of political and corporate power. Helena's archival training allowed her to recognize patterns in the evidence that revealed the organization's current structure. Morrison Holdings operated through legitimate businesses that provided cover for activities that ranged from money laundering to political influence to the elimination of threats. The three families had stumbled onto evidence that could destroy not just reputations, but entire corporate empires. But the conspiracy's most dangerous aspect was its ability to operate through legitimate institutions. Police departments, government agencies, and media companies that had been influenced through decades of careful investment and strategic placement of personnel. The organization didn't just avoid prosecution, it controlled many of the institutions that would be responsible for investigating and prosecuting corporate crime. Thomas discovered that his own university had received significant funding from Morrison Holdings subsidiaries, explaining why his department head had been so eager to distance the institution from his research. The money that paid his salary, funded his research, and supported his academic freedom had come from the same organization that had murdered his uncle to protect war criminals. The final piece of the conspiracy emerged when Helena traced the personal connections between modern corporate leadership and the original Nazi evacuees. Klaus Weber, the Alpine Resort International representative, wasn't just named after Klaus Richter. He was Klaus Richter's grandson, operating under an assumed identity that had been carefully constructed and legally established through decades of document forging and identity manipulation. But what terrified Helena more than the conspiracy's scope was its patience. The organization had spent 65 years building legitimate businesses, establishing political connections, and creating institutional influence that made exposure almost impossible. They weren't reactive criminals trying to hide evidence. They were strategic planners who had anticipated discovery and prepared countermeasures that could neutralize threats through legal, financial, and physical means. The three families now understood why their relatives had chosen death rather than compromise. Operation Glacier hadn't been a failed military mission. It had been the birth of a criminal empire that was still growing, still profiting from stolen wealth, and still killing anyone who threatened to expose its origins. And Helena, Margaret, Thomas, and their extended family of newly discovered relatives had become the greatest threat this organization had faced since three Allied pilots decided that some truths were worth dying for. The question was, would they have the courage to follow their relatives' example and fight an enemy that had spent 65 years perfecting the art of making threats disappear? Or would they become the latest casualties in a war that had never really ended? A war between justice and the organized evil that had learned to hide behind legitimate institutions and respectable facades. The phone call came at 3:17 a.m., jolting Helena from sleep with the electronic urgency that belongs to emergencies and threats. The voice on the other end was professional, calm, and terrifyingly polite. The tone of someone who'd made similar calls many times before. "Ms. Weber, this is regarding your recent research activities. We represent interests that would prefer this matter be resolved quietly and amicably. We're prepared to make an offer that should address your family's concerns while protecting all parties involved." Helena's archivist training had taught her to recognize the weight in words, and these carried the implications of organized power speaking to isolated individuals. But her grandfather's sacrifice had also taught her that some offers were more dangerous than threats, and that compromise with evil was another form of collaboration. "We're not interested in your money," Helena said, her voice steadier than she felt. "We want justice for our families and accountability for the crimes you've covered up for 65 years. The pause that followed lasted long enough for Helena to understand that she'd crossed a line from potential victim to active threat. When the voice resumed, the politeness had acquired edges that cut like surgical instruments. "Ms. Weber, you misunderstand the situation. This isn't a negotiation. It's a final courtesy extended to families who've suffered enough tragedy. Consider carefully whether you want that tragedy to continue into the present generation." Margaret received the same call 40 minutes later in Manchester. Thomas answered his phone in Boston at precisely 4 a.m. local time. The coordination was perfect, the message identical. The implications clear: surrender the evidence and accept financial compensation, or face consequences that had been perfected through 65 years of eliminating inconvenient witnesses. But the organization underestimated the bonds that had formed between family members who discovered they were fighting the same enemy their relatives had died challenging. Helena, Margaret, and Thomas had learned to think like their pilot ancestors, strategically, courageously, and with acceptance that some battles were worth the ultimate price. Their response was coordinated with military precision. Helena contacted international media outlets that had been investigating corporate corruption cases. Margaret reached out to Jewish advocacy organizations that had spent decades tracking Nazi war criminals and stolen assets. Thomas used his academic networks to connect with historians who'd been researching unexplained gaps in World War II documentation. But their most effective strategy was the simplest. They uploaded everything to the internet. Every document from the microfilm, every photograph from the crash site, every piece of evidence connecting 1944's Operation Glacier to 2009's Morrison Holdings empire. The careful documentation that Helena had organized with archival precision became a digital avalanche that overwhelmed the organization's ability to contain or control information. The response was immediate and violent. Jean-Luc's house in Provence was destroyed by a gas explosion that investigators would later classify as accidental. Hans Müller died in a climbing accident in the Swiss Alps that seemed perfectly plausible until examined alongside the other coincidences that had been following Operation Glacier Witnesses for decades. But the digital distribution strategy that Thomas had learned from his younger colleagues made traditional elimination tactics obsolete. The evidence existed on dozens of servers, had been downloaded by hundreds of researchers, and was being analyzed by journalists and historians across multiple continents. Killing the witnesses couldn't kill the story anymore. Helena watched from her Geneva apartment as international media picked up the investigation, each outlet adding pieces that the three families hadn't been able to access through their individual research. Swiss banking authorities began investigating accounts that had been established with Nazi gold. American congressional committees announced hearings into wartime collaboration. European prosecutors opened cases into corporate assets that might have been derived from stolen wealth. But the organization's counterattack revealed the true scope of its influence. Media outlets that initially covered the story began receiving legal challenges that questioned the authenticity of the evidence. Government officials who'd announced investigations suddenly discovered procedural obstacles that delayed or prevented prosecution. Academic researchers found their funding cut and their institutional support withdrawn. Margaret realized they were fighting an enemy that had learned to use legitimate institutions as weapons. Every court filing, every regulatory challenge, every institutional pressure was designed to exhaust their resources and make pursuit of justice too expensive and complex for ordinary families to sustain. The turning point came when Marie Claire, despite her advanced age and the danger to herself, agreed to testify publicly about her wartime experiences and the evidence she'd preserved for 65 years. Her television appearance, broadcast internationally, provided human context that no amount of corporate legal maneuvering could obscure. "I kept my husband's promise for 65 years, Marie Claire said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. He died to protect evidence that evil men were being saved while good men were being sacrificed. I will not let his death be meaningless." Thomas coordinated with historians across multiple universities to create a comprehensive academic response that documented the conspiracy with scholarly rigor that couldn't be dismissed as sensationalism or conspiracy theory. The evidence met every standard of historical verification and was presented through institutions that corporate influence couldn't entirely control. Helena's methodical documentation provided the evidentiary foundation that prosecutors needed to build criminal cases against specific individuals and corporate entities. Her archival training had created evidence chains that met legal standards for international war crimes prosecution. But the organization's final strategy was the most dangerous. They stopped trying to hide and began attacking directly. Helena's apartment was burglarized by professionals who took only the original documents while leaving valuable electronics untouched. Margaret received death threats that were too specific and too well informed to be random harassment. Thomas discovered that his home had been placed under surveillance by people with government credentials that might or might not have been legitimate. The three families faced the same choice their relatives had confronted in 1944: surrender to superior force and let evil continue unopposed, or fight, knowing that victory might require the ultimate sacrifice. Their decision was unanimous and immediate. If their relatives could choose death over collaboration with evil, three elderly family members could choose truth over personal safety. But they had advantages their relatives hadn't possessed: international attention that made their elimination more difficult to disguise, digital evidence that couldn't be destroyed by killing the witnesses. Most importantly, they had each other and an extended family of allies who understood that some fights were worth joining regardless of personal risk. The war that had begun in 1944 was finally approaching its conclusion. But the outcome would depend on whether modern institutions of justice were strong enough to confront organized evil that had spent 65 years learning to hide behind legitimate facades, and whether three families who'd started their journey seeking closure for personal loss were prepared to see their quest through to whatever end justice demanded. 2 years later, Helena stood in the same Swiss courthouse where the legal battle had begun. But now she wasn't fighting for excavation permits or archaeological access. She was watching Klaus Weber, the man who'd tried to bury her grandfather's truth under concrete and steel, led away in handcuffs after being convicted of war crimes conspiracy, money laundering, and accessory to murder. The conviction had taken 24 months of international legal cooperation, testimony from 47 witnesses across 12 countries, and evidence that filled 300 bankers' boxes with documents, spanning from 1944 to 2009. But Helena's methodical documentation had provided the foundation that made justice possible, proving that archives preserved not just history, but accountability. Margaret watched from the gallery as the judge read the sentence that included restitution, payments to Holocaust survivors' families whose wealth had been stolen and laundered through Morrison Holdings' corporate empire for 65 years. Her father's name had been cleared not just in family memory, but in official records that would ensure his heroism was documented for future generations. Thomas had testified as an expert witness, using his historical training to explain how Operation Glacier connected to broader patterns of wartime collaboration and post-war cover-up. His university had restored his research funding and created a new program studying corporate accountability for historical crimes, a program funded by assets seized from Morrison Holdings subsidiaries. But the legal victory was only part of the justice their relatives had died seeking. The evidence they'd uncovered had triggered investigations that exposed corruption in banks, corporations, and government agencies across multiple continents. Hundreds of people had been arrested. Billions in stolen assets had been recovered, and institutions that had been compromised by Nazi gold had been forced to acknowledge their complicity. Marie-Claire had lived to see her husband's sacrifice vindicated, watching from her Provence cottage as international media covered the trials that exposed the conspiracy she'd helped document. She'd died peacefully 6 months after Klaus Weber's conviction, her final letter expressing gratitude that the truth had finally been stronger than the organization that had tried to bury it. The crash site in the Swiss Alps had been preserved as a memorial that honored not just the 3 pilots, but all the witnesses who'd been eliminated over 65 years for getting too close to the truth. Helena visited annually, bringing flowers and new evidence as investigations continued to reveal additional victims and co-conspirators. But the most meaningful victory was personal. Helena's apartment no longer felt haunted by unanswered questions about her grandfather's fate. She understood that Friedrich Weber had died a hero's death, choosing justice over survival and truth over comfort. The photograph on her mantel now represented not mysterious loss, but understood sacrifice. Margaret had rebuilt her relationship with her father's memory, understanding that James Bennett's supposed cowardice had been a deliberate cover story designed to protect the truth about his heroism. She'd established a scholarship fund for children of military families, ensuring that future generations would understand the difference between true service and institutional betrayal. Thomas had written the definitive academic account of Operation Glacier, a book that was used in universities worldwide to teach about the complexities of wartime morality and the importance of individual conscience when institutional authority becomes corrupted. His uncle's mathematical precision had inspired a new generation of historians to use quantitative analysis in exposing systematic cover-ups. The extended family that had emerged from their investigation remained connected across international boundaries, united by shared understanding of what their relatives had sacrificed and what they themselves had risked to honor that sacrifice. Jean-Luc had rebuilt his house in Provence and established a museum documenting resistance activities in his village. Hans and Greta's Swiss relatives had created a foundation supporting families whose property had been stolen during the war. But Helena knew that victory against organized evil was never permanent. Other corporations built on stolen wealth continued operating, Other government officials maintained classified files that protected inconvenient truths. Other families deserved answers about relatives who'd disappeared defending principles that powerful people preferred to forget. The difference was that now there was precedent. Legal procedures had been established for prosecuting corporate entities that profited from historical crimes. International cooperation protocols had been developed for tracing stolen assets across multiple jurisdictions. Most importantly, digital preservation techniques made it almost impossible for evidence to be destroyed through traditional witness elimination. Helena had returned to her archival work, but with expanded purpose. She'd accepted a position with the International Court of Justice, helping develop systems for preserving evidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Her grandfather's sacrifice had taught her that archives weren't just repositories of the past, but weapons against impunity. On the second anniversary of Klaus Weber's conviction, Helena received a package with no return address. Inside was a photograph of 3 pilots standing beside their aircraft, taken weeks before their final mission. On the back, written in her grandfather's familiar handwriting, were words that she'd never seen before. For Helena, some truths are worth more than life. Some fights are worth more than victory. Some love is stronger than death. Your grandfather did not die. He chose to live forever in the choice between right and wrong. Choose right, always. The photograph had been hidden in Marie Claire's cottage and discovered during renovation work after her death. But its message resonated beyond personal comfort. Every generation faced the choice between convenience and conscience, between institutional loyalty and individual integrity, between comfortable silence and dangerous truth. Helena understood that her grandfather's real legacy wasn't the specific victory over Morrison Holdings or the exposure of Operation Glacier. It was the demonstration that ordinary people could choose extraordinary courage when confronted with organized evil that seemed too powerful to challenge. As she placed the photograph beside the one that had watched over her childhood, Helena made the same promise her grandfather had made in 1944. When faced with the choice between right and wrong, she would choose right, always. No matter the cost, no matter the risk, no matter how powerful the forces that preferred darkness to light. Some truths were indeed worth more than life. And some stories, once told, could never be untold. The 3 pilots had finally come home, not to rest, but to inspire. Not to endings, but to beginnings. Not to silence, but to eternal testimony that individual conscience could defeat institutional evil. That family love could overcome official indifference. And that truth, however long buried, would eventually find its way to light. If this story left you as impacted as it did me, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and comment your opinion below. Each comment is like a new piece that can help unravel other mysteries like this one. Because somewhere out there, other families are still waiting for answers about heroes who were sacrificed to protect secrets that powerful people hope will stay buried forever. But as Helena, Margaret, and Thomas proved, some secrets are too important to stay hidden, and some truths are too powerful to remain silent.